this debate in the Strand in conversation with dissidents entitled Why Do We Get Fat? I'm Rob Lyons, and I'm the Science and Technology Director at the Academy of Ideas. And our dissident this afternoon is Anthony Warner. Anthony is a professional chef, writer and creator of the Angry Chef blog. He's the author of The Angry Chef, Bad Science and the Truth About Healthy Eating, and he's currently writing a book about the sustainability of food systems, which he told me he's just finished yesterday? Or?
Well, last week, yeah.
Yeah, okay. But in this session, we'll be focusing on the book that Chris Snowden is writing on, this one, The Truth About Fat, Why Obesity is Not That Simple. Now, clearly, obesity has been a massive issue in politics and society for some time around the world, and not just in the wealthy West, but in many developing countries as well. People are getting fatter. And obesity is associated with a variety of chronic health problems, like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, so much more. And in its most extreme forms, it's disabling. We hear almost constantly about the rising tide of obesity, and if public discussion is to be believed, it feels like it's out of control. Moreover, attempting not to be obese has been a major concern for well over a century, at least. Probably the mid-19th century or something would be the earliest attempts at diet books. So why do we get fat? Are we facing an obesity time bomb? So if you've not been in the Strand earlier, the format's a bit different. I'll kick off a conversation with Anthony on the ideas in his book, and then we'll broaden things out with two other speakers, which I'll now introduce. So on my left, Helen West is a registered dietitian specialising in eating disorders and a weight-inclusive approach to health. She's made it her mission to counter nutri-nonsense and help people make informed choices about their diet and their health. In 2016, Helen co-founded the Rooted Project with fellow dietitian Rosie Sant to provide people with evidence-based nutrition information in an easy-to-understand and engaging format. And they published their first book, Is Butter a Carb? Unpicking Fact from Fiction in the World of Nutrition, earlier this year. June this year. And then on my right is Christopher Snowden. He's the head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. His research focuses on lifestyle freedoms, prohibition, and policy-based evidence. His work encompasses a wide range of topics, including sin taxes, state funding of charities, happiness economics, public health regulation, gambling, and the black market. Among the many reports he's produced with the IEA, Sweet Truth about the dangers of sugar tax, co-authored with me. So, anyway, there we go. So I know it. Anyway, right. So, let's get down to business. Let's just have some physics here. Physics in particular, the first law of thermodynamics, which in relation to bodies means that energy stored must equal energy in minus energy out. Or to put it in public health terms, eat less and move more if you want to lose weight. And that's been advice for, you mentioned possibly thousands of years in relation to, in your book. So what's wrong with that? Aren't we just lacking in willpower, and actually we just have to stop eating so much and take some more exercise?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why I wrote a book on it, because it is incredibly complex, and that sort of oversimplification, I think, is at the heart of a lot of what we get wrong about that. But a lot of, and saying that does challenge a lot of people, and a lot of people get very upset. A lot of people get very, very angry with me, which I'm sort of qualified to deal with perfectly well, when I do that, because it challenges their preconceptions. It challenges what we've been told. It challenges what we've been sold for many, many years, standard dietary advice. And we've been sold that by big corporations. We've been sold that by public health organisations. But it is, in some ways, it is inherently flawed advice. And there are a number of reasons why, and to really go into the science of why it is more complex than that, would take a very long time, but the most simplistic way I can explain it is this. Our body, in many different ways, regulates itself and it creates a sort of has lots of homeostatic mechanisms to keep things as they are, keep our blood sugar the same, to keep all of our processes running. And one of those is the maintenance of a particular weight. Now, that weight is not defined by how heavy we want to be. That weight is not defined by, how heavy society tells us we should be. That weight is not defined by aesthetics. It's just there's a predetermined weight which our body fights really, really hard to maintain, and that is controlled almost entirely by our genetics. So, body weight is you can look at twin studies, and these are not figures. I'm not sort of picking these figures out of nowhere. You can do twin studies and look at how heritable it is. Different characteristics are. So you can see how heritable height is, how heritable hair colour is, how heritable eye colour is. And if you take identical twins, some things will be exactly the same. So your hair colour as a child is probably about 100% heritable, because all identical twins will have the same colour hair. Some non-identical twins will have slightly different colour hair. And you can look at characteristics and see how heritable they are. Height is about 80% heritable, because there's environmental impacts on your height. Because you will, if your diet or illness can change the height you're going to be. Body weight, or BMI, which we use to define obesity, is around about 70% heritable. So it's one of the most heritable characteristics that's ever been studied by science. It's not entirely heritable like hair colour is, but it is a highly heritable characteristic. And people then tell me that I'm getting that wrong, and lots of people have very publicly told me that that's absolute nonsense, because BMI has been increasing and our genetics haven't changed. And yes, our genetics haven't changed. So before people accuse me of not understanding genetics, but what has changed is our environment, and our body weight is more heritable when food is freely available. And the difference between society now and society 100 or 50 years ago is that more people have free access to as much food as they can eat. If you go back 50, 60 years, lots and lots of people were hungry. And we don't like to think about that in this country. We don't like to think that a lot of people in the lower echelons of society were hungry at that time and not having enough to eat. But now pretty much all of us have enough to eat. And that in many ways is a huge triumph and a wonderful thing. But what that means is more and more people's genetically predetermined weight is expressed in full. And so more and more people are reaching a higher size. Now that's not to say that there aren't things people can do. Because I said it's 70% heritable. So eating less and moving more. I mean, I think moving more is probably. I think getting more exercise if you can is probably a pretty good advice. There are lots of other reasons why moving more and doing some form of activity is good. For lots of other health benefits of that. There's some evidence that might sort of reduce the set point that your body fights to achieve a little bit more. But it's interesting, and that is incredibly challenging for people. When I studied biochemistry at university, and that was quite a long time ago, and the mechanisms by which the body fought to maintain weight weren't really understood. They were just becoming known then. So it's reasonably new science. There's a hormone leptin, which is very involved in this, and a number of other hormonal processes. It's very tightly governed by our body, what weight we achieve. And that's really, but much of it is not our choice. It's kind of, unless we are going to start starving people deliberately, that we kind of have to accept that people are going to be a spectrum of different weights, and for some reason society is going to deem some of those to be unacceptable, and deem that there's a certain BMI everyone should be achieving.
Okay, so I suppose, as you say, it's probably a very complicated thing, but in terms of how genetics works, how does it make me, because I think I'm clearly the chubbiest person on this panel, how does it make me store fat rather than someone who's like you, who's very skinny? Is it that it makes me more hungry? Is it somehow that my fat cells are more receptive to fat, or some combination of things? How does it actually work?
It's a combination of the things. We all have a certain number of fat cells in our body, which our body uses to store fat. It's essential we have some fat stored. And the hormones I'm talking about were discovered mostly started to be discovered in the sort of early 90s. Leptin particularly was an important one, which was discovered by a researcher called Jeffrey Friedman, who kind of pioneered, an endocrinologist who pioneered this field. So what happens is I'll actually tell you about how it was discovered, because that kind of illustrates where this comes from. There are certain people who have, and it's very, very rare, most hormonal sort of deficiencies like this are extremely rare, who cannot produce the hormone leptin. They have a genetic problem which means they're unable to produce it. And what that means is that they constantly think they're starving. They constantly think there is no fat stored within their fat cells. What usually happens is you start to store some fat in your cells, the hormone is released, and that will reduce your appetite, but it will also change your metabolism as well. You know, if your body thinks it's starving, it will do everything it can to change your base background metabolism. It will shut down all the non-essential functions. So it will shut down your immune function, because that's kind of an insurance policy long term. It will make you feel cold. It will drop your body temperature slightly. It will do anything it can to save energy, and it will also give you an insatiable demand for food. So people who have a genetic deformity, which means they cannot control that, have all those things reduced, but also have an absolutely insatiable appetite, and they do become sort of enormously obese. But as soon as you treat them with the hormone leptin, then that completely changes everything about them. Their appetite is decreased and becomes normal. Children with this condition, the parents would have to lock cupboards and fridges, because they're constantly plagued by this insatiable appetite. And that's what happens. The appetite is probably one of the biggest thing. And all the genes, there's about 300 genes which are associated with higher BMIs, and all of them are in the brain.
Right.
All of them are expressed in the brain, pretty much. I think there's one or two that aren't, but yeah, pretty much all of them are expressed in the brain. So it's all the processes of the brain which control appetite. And it's an instinctive thing. People say you can just override it, but this is the same part of the brain which controls your desire to breathe or your desire to drink water if you're thirsty. You can fight those urges for a certain amount of time. If I said to everyone, don't breathe for the next couple of minutes, you would all be able to do it, but you wouldn't be able. It would be the eventual breath you take would be involuntary, and it's very much like that. If food is freely available, these hormones are so strong at driving your appetite that eventually you will give in to them.
Right. Okay. So, are you saying that diets just don't work? I mean, because you really lay into celebrity diets in this book, which I find quite enjoyable. Having, I don't know, Davina McCall, who's skinny anyway, saying, "Do my 8-week plan," or whatever it is, and then you'll be slightly skinnier still, and you can look like me. And I'm very sceptical about those. But then there's other people like Tom Kerridge, who was really a very big man and seems to be quite a slim man now, or relatively slim man now. So is there no... I have no idea what the Tom Kerridge's diet or Davina McCall's diet or anybody else's diet is. But is it possible that actually there is a diet out there that does work, or that might work for us as individuals or something? Or is it just that this whole idea is we're just fighting against this genetic predisposition? Yeah,
it depends what I mean by work. Obviously, if the idea is to achieve a lower BMI, they can almost every single diet, unless they're developed by an idiot, it will work in the short term. Right. Okay, every single one. If you restrict what you eat, if you take out a whole food group, if you stop eating carbs, you will lose weight, because you'll be taking in fewer calories and you will temporarily lose weight. Your body will then think that it's starving. Yeah. Because your body doesn't know what weight you want it to be. So as soon as the amount of fat you have stored in your cells goes below what it thinks is the optimum that you should be keeping, then it starts to enact all these processes, which everyone who's ever been on a diet will be familiar with. You will become incredibly hungry, you will become weak, you will become tired, you will get ill more easily, all those things will happen. But that's not to say that there is no, and actually if you look at the data, and Helen's probably better on this than me, but if you look at the data, the long-term success of these diets, short-term success is very, very high, because if you restrict what you eat, you will lose some weight over the short term. The long-term success is extremely poor. Most people put that weight back on. Many people put more weight back on than they did than they'd lost. There is a certain effect. If your body thinks it's starving, it's a pretty sensible evolutionary strategy for you to then say, oh, when food's available, I better try and store a bit more fat because there's periods of famine coming. So that's probably an evolved strategy. Your body will say, oh my God, the food supply is really insecure, let's store a bit more energy, because when it becomes more insecure later on, we'll have a bit more energy in reserve. That's probably a pretty sensible evolutionary strategy for your body to do. So you're fighting that as well. People will put on more weight long term. They will They will, have a number of health problems associated with that sort of weight cycling and that sort of exclusion diet, and it becomes very, very problematic. The whole idea that people are being sold these diets constantly and completely failing all the time, and then every time they fail, they're told it's your fault because you weren't good enough to stick to the diet. That is incredibly damaging psychologically, but it's also probably pretty damaging physiologically. We have this obsession that achieving a lower BMI is going to be this sort of produce this fantastic health benefit, but we never really investigate what the health harms are of putting people into that sort of cycling of weight, which seem to be certainly psychologically very damaging and probably physiologically pretty damaging as well.
Well, you mentioned Helen, so I'll bring Helen in at this point. Is that your experience of the failure of diets? And if somebody comes to you and is big to the point where they're unhappy, or actually it's causing some obvious harm, I mean, well, how would you approach trying to deal with that problem? Or is it something that we should just accept that some of us are just bigger than others?
So I think there's two questions there, but
Yep.
So from the first question, I think, sorry, I'll go with it. So for someone who came to me, I work from a weight inclusive approach to health. So I think, and what that means is looking at health in a broader context than weight. So I think the point of this whole conversation is talking about fat and fat being kind of a marker of health and a risk factor for poor health. And what we kind of do from a public health perspective is target the fat rather than thinking about health in this broader perspective, as Anthony's kind of touched on with sort of mental health, social health, that kind of thing as well. So I don't prescribe diets to people. I work from a weight inclusive perspective, which means that I support people to find ways to improve their lifestyle if that's what they want to do. I work a lot with eating disorders, so quite often there's people that have really damaged relationships with food, binge eating disorder, that kind of thing. So I don't prescribe diets to people, mostly because I think the data shows, as Nancy mentioned, that they don't really work in the longer term, and that's kind of a sort of a broad overview. Obviously, there are some people that will go on a diet and will lose weight. The statistics, I think, are about somewhere between 80 to 95% of people that go on a diet in the short term will regain most of that weight in the long term, probably about 80% of that weight in the long term. And then there are people that will succeed and that will lose a lot of weight. And there's a lot of inter-individual variability, we call it, with diets, things like low carb, low fat diets. Some people do really well and sort of maybe lose a lot of weight if that's their goal. Some people won't do so well. So it's really hard to predict who will do well in the short term and who won't do so well.
Well, this is to both of you, but isn't that quite a gloomy prospectus then? Because people do have all sorts of different reasons why they want to lose weight. I mean, I, from time to time, attempt to diet. I give up the doner kebabs for a little while at least. And, because, just for vanity reasons, if nothing else, I want my clothes to fit properly, and or practical reasons, like it's quite tiring hauling a lot of weight around when you would like to actually be out and being active or whatever. So isn't that quite a negative or like gloomy perspective that you don't have control over things?
I think what you want to think about, and that's what I mean about broadening your perspective of health, is more than aesthetics. So there are lots of things that people might be able to do if they're able to improve their lifestyle. And so it's not to say that those things aren't important, not to say that if you want to improve the quality of your diet, say that you can do that and that won't improve your health, or that you can't be more physically active, and that's not a good thing. So it's not denying the health benefits of those things, it's just recognising that we can do those things, and they may result in weight loss for some people, and for other people they won't, but everybody will improve their health. And so that's the perspective and the angle that I'm working from.
I'd also say, I completely agree with that. There's loads of stuff you can do if you want to be healthier, or you want to be more mobile, or you want to be more active. There is loads of really, really positive things that people can do. But when you focus all the efforts on saying, if I lose the weight, then I will be all those things, first of all, you're probably setting yourself up to failure, because diets will fail. But you're also, it creates a number of unintended consequences. And one of the people often go to the gym. Some people say, I won't diet, I'm going to go to the gym, and that's going to be my weight loss strategy. And if people are doing that, often that will not work because your appetite will be increased, and you will get fitter and you will get stronger and you will probably improve a number of markers of health, but you will not lose weight. So when people are so focused on saying, I need to lose the weight, they might then go, oh, the gym's not working. Even though it's improving a load of stuff in their life and a load of stuff for their health, they will go, it's not working. And you'll hear this a lot from people who engage in exercise. It's not working. Well, it is working. It's just not working if the only marker you have of health is the number on the scale rather than broader, am I healthier, am I more active, do I have more energy, or that sort of thing.
What do you think, Chris? Is this touchy-feely nonsense, and it's actually that people just need to just develop some self-control?
No, I basically agree with nearly everything that Anthony says in this book. It's been educational for me, really. It's certainly given me a more nuanced view of the whole issue. Before, I was pretty much on the calories in, calories out side. And now I can see it's really very complicated. I mean, my main takeaway from it is more or less, as Anthony said, is that a combination of genetics and affluence has got us to this point. One of the most interesting parts of the book for me is the graph that he shows, which I hadn't seen before, which shows BMI over a period of about 100 years. And contrary to popular belief, the popular belief being that around about 1980 something changed and obesity just suddenly shot up. What actually happened is BMI has just been gradually rising for decades, and because we set BMI at 30 at some point, loads of people just started moving over that. And as he quite rightly points out, if we set obesity as a BMI of 32, then it would have happened later. If it said it at 28, it would have happened earlier. There's nothing special that happened in 1980. One of the craziest opinions you read about this is that the changing of the food guidelines in the US suddenly led to everyone stuffing their face with sugar, because apparently these new guidelines said eat lots of carbs, especially sugar, which of course they didn't. So you have to say it as a long-term development. And what's happened over that long term? Basically, people have just become richer. You can call that a change in the environment. I actually think it's the affluence rather than the environment. The environment is a sort of product of the affluence. People can afford to eat more or less as many calories as they want to. Tasty food is readily available and affordable. It hasn't always been that way, and therefore all the people who are kind of predisposed to being obese are becoming or have become obese. There are other things on the margins, and Anthony goes through them very fairly one by one. I think probably the increase in access to central heating has probably had some effect. I think the decline in smoking has had some effect, but primarily it's about affluence, genetics, and the decline in physical activity. That's something I have not changed my mind about. I'm convinced that a large part of that rise in BMI over a long period of time is because people are not moving around as much. I don't mean going out to the gym for exercise. The fact that people go to the gym for exercise is precisely the result of physical activity being modelled out of people's day-to-day lives. But just in domestic surroundings and particularly in work surroundings, people are simply not moving around. There's just not as many physical jobs as there used to be. There's far more office jobs and desk-bound jobs. So that's been one of the main changes along with the affluence. Finally, what do you take from that? In a way, it's a gloomy picture because none of those things are really going to change, right? You can't change the genetics. We're not likely to suddenly see a rise in smoking or people turning the central heating off. And hopefully people will continue to become richer. I don't think, other than advising people to move around a bit more if they can, there isn't a lot I don't think we can do about it. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have successive governments throwing everything at this problem until finally, perhaps, they will concede that it's intractable.
I want to just wind back to that point about BMI guidelines, because you make the point very clearly. If they'd drawn the BMI guideline at a less sophisticated number, like 29 or 31, then the obesity epidemic would have taken off at some other point in time. But so is the term obesity epidemic or time bomb actually useful? Does it mean anything? Is there this thing happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think I say fairly clearly in the book, it didn't happen. It's been a long-term historical trend, which is an interesting thing and something we should probably be interested in. but we don't necessarily need to see it as quite the problem it is, especially when we look at how our health has increased over the same period. It's not like the BMI has gone up. It's not like health has declined since the 1980s. Actually, quite the opposite in almost every single measure. We are living longer and not dying as much of communicable diseases, but non-communicable diseases, heart disease levels have decreased, and almost in almost every measure we are healthier and better off and have better lives than we used to. But there's this need for a crisis. The military metaphors that you mentioned, the ticking time bomb, the war on obesity, the battle against obesity, I don't think they're helpful at all. I think what that does is viciously stigmatizes people who are just either achieving a BMI which society doesn't for some reason think is ideal, or they have a number of problems which have caused that. If you look at, it's worth, I think, worrying about some of the people at the extremes of obesity. We are seeing more and more people with really extreme BMIs, very, very high of 50, 55. And we need to think about why those numbers have increased so much. There is a genetic cause, but in those levels, often it's less genetic, and there are other reasons why that's occurring. One is something that Helen mentioned, which is eating disorder. So if you look at the bariatric surgery population in this country, so the most obese people in this country, something like 50 to 60% of them will be suffering from binge eating disorder. Okay, the idea that we can restructure the food environment to prevent that is quite frankly absurd. What we need to do is have really good treatment pathways for these people, because binge eating disorder is associated with it's very, very complex mental health condition. It's associated with childhood trauma, and it's associated with all sorts of pretty awful things that have happened to people, and that causes 50 to 60% of the most severely obese people are suffering from binge eating disorder.
It's also associated with diets as well, though binge eating disorder isn't just something that you see at sort of very high weights. It's something you see across the weight spectrum, and it's associated with restriction and diets. Can I just come back to what Chris was saying? I think one of the things that we need to kind of hammer home, I know that you said that obviously we're wealthier and we've got more affluence and we're healthier than we were before, but it is worth pointing out that higher weight does have a social gradient, so it does disproportionately affect people at the kind of the lower end of the socioeconomic groups, which I think we have to be very careful when we're framing things like choice and things that we can do, and sort of what the government's responsibility is towards these people, because choice obviously isn't something, it's something that we all probably have as quite privileged people on the stage to make every day, but there are people that don't have the same choices as us or can't make the same choices as us.
Can you explain, how do you mean they can't make the same choices?
So if you imagine, so for example, as a healthcare professional, I'm quite a privileged person, so I would see people who have less money than me, that maybe can't afford childcare, that are maybe working 2 jobs. Perhaps they don't have access. I've just worked recently in the homeless sector, so perhaps they don't have access to a fridge or a kitchen, that kind of thing. So, people are, and not just from a financial perspective, when you're talking about poverty and sort of lower socioeconomic groups, there's an emotional labour there as well. So if people are working long hours, not able to, coming home to 2 kids, not having the time in the day to cook or to make those choices, and so convenience food becomes more of an option. Not to say that all convenience food is bad, but it's not the same, I think, for people at the higher end of the spectrum than it is at the lower end of the spectrum. So you will see obviously weight across different socioeconomic groups, higher weights across all socioeconomic groups, but it does disproportionately affect people at the lower end.
So if we don't have those, or some people don't have those choices, is there a role then for government to come in and start managing those choices, or to improve the choice environment? I think that's the kind of phrase that they would use.
I think managing those choices, again, you're focusing on the individual. I think really what we want to do is improve people's social circumstances. So if you're wanting to improve people's health, then you want to improve, you want to help improve their wealth, you want to help improve so they have more options and more choices available to them. So it's about tackling inequality, which is one of the main drivers of poor health and the main drivers of high weight, rather than thinking about trying to manage people's behaviour and choices. It's about giving people opportunities to make good choices.
Let's go in on that, because I think there's quite a lot of truth in it, but at the same time it's quite easy to exaggerate the socioeconomic variable. I think the figure in this book is 29% obesity amongst the most deprived and 21% amongst the least deprived. So there's a lot of obesity going on amongst the richest people in society, and indeed always has been, for going back centuries, whether it's Edward IV or Henry VIII or what have you. So there is a difference there, and the question is, why is that the case? Why is the smoking rate 3 times higher amongst the low-income people than it is amongst the high-income people? And my view is one reason, amongst others, I'm not saying it's the only one by any means, is that tasty food, which is usually high in calories, is very enjoyable to consume, and you might discount future health costs a bit more if your life is rather miserable, and put more focus on tasty food and indeed smoking and alcohol. If you need some form of joy. I mean, Orwell wrote about this in The Road to Wigan Pier. He was under no illusion why the working class of Wigan was consuming vastly more sugar and 0 brown bread, as opposed to the Guardian readers of the time. So the government's approach is to essentially take that away. The government is not going to meaningfully improve these people's lives. They're just going to take away some parts of it which give them a little bit of pleasure. That applies actually to the whole of society, but of course it's always framed in terms of helping people on low incomes. I mean, Anthony finishes off the book by saying, the real solution to this is reduce inequality and give everyone a great education, give everyone a great job for life. Well, we'd all like to do that, but unfortunately it's not that simple. And in practice, what public health people do is they talk about how they'd like to change these root causes and give people a better life, but they have no means by which they can do this. The only things they can really do are lobby for things like the sugar tax and minimum pricing, things that are just going to actually make people's life a little bit more miserable.
There was just going back to that poor versus rich sort of the stats, because I think figures I saw a few years ago, and I could be wildly wrong and misremember them, were that there's a sex difference to this. So when it comes to men, actually, if anything, richer men are fatter than poorer men.
About the same, I think.
But there's certainly that there isn't a huge difference. With women, on the other hand, and maybe this is social pressure, that actually the wealthier you are as a woman, the skinnier you get. Is there social pressures on that, which means that middle class and upper middle class women actually feel much more pressure to starve themselves all the time to stay skinny?
Partly. I mean, I would say you are exactly right. The differences are massive in women on a socioeconomic gradient, far less on men, and. I mean, yes, there may be that sort of social pressure to diet, but as we've said, diets aren't particularly effective ways of managing that. I see it as more the lived experience of poverty is much harder for women than it is for men. Women are usually carers for children. They're incredibly socially stigmatised, perhaps less than they were in the 1990s, when single mothers were the scourge of every tabloid newspaper. Now it is obese single mothers usually are sort of denigrated in television programmes and shamed for sort of living on benefits. So I think the lived experience of poverty is harder, and that pushes people into choices for exactly the reason that Chris just mentioned. Life is very, very difficult, and much of the local economy of some of the poorest areas of this country is dedicated to relieving that stress in some way. So when you start taking things away, I think it's a good idea to try and encourage good things within that environment. But I think when you start taking things away, or you start banning things, or you start banning takeaways, or you start saying you can't have this, people it doesn't take away the stress. It doesn't. All it does is it pushes the problem somewhere else, and people say, "What am I going? I still need to do something to manage my stress. I can't afford to go on a foreign holiday. I can't afford to relax at a nice health club. I need cheap ways of managing the levels of stress that I'm under, and that is harder for women because they generally have a more stressful experience of poverty.
I think, just going back to the point about women, I think as well it's quite a good example of the privilege of choice, because if you're a middle class, affluent, middle-aged woman, you can prioritise your health, you might prioritise your weight, you might prioritise dieting and restriction. I think a lot of women in lower socioeconomic groups probably do diet a lot. I think they probably diet quite often. Slimming World is really popular, that kind of thing. But I think when you moving up socioeconomic class, people have more time to exercise. They have more, they have more options of food options, that kind of thing. So I think it's probably a reflection of the fact that people have the opportunity to prioritise their health rather than a reflection of anything else.
Anything to add to that before I go to the audience?
It doesn't really explain why it's higher amongst women than men, though. I mean, all those
Well, that's
things seem to apply to men as well.
Yeah, well, so I think societal pressure is higher on women, though, isn't it?
Right.
We have, the beauty ideals, the thin ideals, that kind of thing. So I think for women to be able to pursue those and enact those, and what a thin woman symbolises, if you think about what we think about in terms of fat and thin, and the moralisation of weight and that kind of thing, then those pressures are, I think they apply to men as well, but I think they are much higher on women. And so,
I think men do increasingly face sort of stigmatisation of sort of living in a larger body, and that's something that is far more prevalent now, and people will talk about health and talk about people being a drain on the health system and that sort of thing. With women, I think there tends to be a very different attitude. It tends to be an association with intelligence in women within the media. So larger, more courageous women are generally thought of as not being very clever. If you Google image like female lawyer or female doctor, it will always be a skinny woman. It's like you can only professionally achieve status and success as a woman if you are sort of a particular type of body, whereas doctors can be and businessmen can be fat cats and that sort of thing. It's very different. I think there are social pressures on men to achieve an aesthetic ideal and achieve a health ideal, but I think the pressures on women are sort of very different.
I've got a few more questions I would like to ask you all, but I think it's time to get out to the audience and see what your concerns are and interests are. So
I don't look too overweight, I think people tell me, but I do have a tendency to put on a bit of weight around my stomach because I like eating nice food, as you say. And frankly, the stuff which is low calorie is really depressing. And it is like rabbit food, as they say. And the guidance on the packet of Cadbury's 100-gram chocolate to be treat-wise, I'm sorry, I cannot just have a few squares. I want the whole bloody thing. I want to ask, I suppose, can I keep eating chocolate? Because if you take chocolate out of my life, it's going to be a bit more miserable. And I want to eat, quite a lot of chocolate, but maybe, not all at once, I accept.
Hi there. I'm a bit depressed because I've actually lost quite a lot of weight in the last couple of years, and according to you, I'm going to put it all back on. So I'm a bit worried when that's going to happen. I'm just quite new to the discussion, and I have been going to a gym, again, for the first time ever in my life, because I felt, well, I need to make a change. And they do preach eat less calories than you can need during the day, and you'll lose weight. And the gym's full of people who are doing that. And you're just saying and they are using their willpower, and they've changed their diet. I've changed my diet fully for the last couple of years. I don't think it's being on a diet, necessarily. It's just changing your diet. I think that's quite an interesting, maybe a distinction that's worth considering. My diet, in relation to the guy who's just spoken down there, you can lose some taste and flavour, I think, but then there's new things that I'm enjoying eating. So I'm just curious to know whether the sort of new sort of paradigm, eat less than you need, is that so wrong, really?
Okay, right, so, yes.
I'm just sort of confused about the direction of the conversation, because we started with the sort of genetic determinism that everyone will naturally go to their established weight because everyone has access to lots of calories. And then we've just finished with 15 minutes of how lifestyle and socioeconomic choices cause massive variance within those things due to various different pressures. So clearly upper middle class women are somehow fighting against this genetic determinism, or poorer people are genetically more obese. Which is it?
I'm a bit confused about this because Ian Warner, that you said that hormones are involuntary and you've got a kind of a natural body weight that your body will try and get to. But I just looked up the definition of obesity, and it says it's when you've got excess fat and it's a problem for your health. So your body is not going to want to cause you deliberately. Your ideal body weight is not going to be obesity. So I don't actually kind of understand what... all that you seem to be saying is that we all have a body weight that's kind of natural for us and genetically organised or propensity, and it's stockier than the norm. the ideal, this contemporary norm. And it seems to me that it's taken centuries for us to evolve, our bodies to evolve, and it's the first generation in history really that's had enough to eat, kind of generally speaking, for the majority. So it's going to take another few centuries for us to kind of get used to the fact that we've got sedentary lifestyle. Sorry, it'll take another few generations or centuries to evolve to kind of like even all that out. Plus, we also have existential emptiness in the society nowadays. So people are, quite justified, I think, in finding what they can do to get through the day and deal with the stress and the emptiness. So, this sounds so mundane, but I don't understand why you say. I don't think obesity is to do with your ideal body weight. People are not programmed to be obese. So can you please clarify that? And secondly, can we not just say it's just that society makes us fuss about this too much, and that's really all it is?
Okay, so that's a very good point.
I just wanted to make one addition to the point about people having their metabolism making them reach a set weight. I absolutely agree with that if somebody has a healthy metabolism, but I do think there are things that can cause people to have an impaired metabolism. An example of that is people developing diabetes. We're trying to keep our blood sugar at a constant level. If we eat constantly or regularly eat pure forms of sugar, we can impair our body's ability to be able to control blood sugar, and we do see effects around people's weight. And I think there are things that we eat that can affect us having a healthy metabolism, and with an unhealthy metabolism, we can then see the effects of weight gain. So I just wanted to add that and hear your reaction to that as an extra dimension here. It does give something that people can actually affect through what they eat in terms of what they end up weighing.
Take one more and then I'll bring the panel back in.
Yeah, following on from what the lady there said, I'm surprised that Anthony's saying that health has increased in the country, when we're always told that diabetes levels within the country are going up dramatically, and that must be a big problem. Also, I was going to mention, Helen says that she doesn't prescribe diets to the people she sees, but I know that many GP practices are still prescribing their healthy diet with low fat and relatively high carbs, and this is what still carries on fueling our diet industry with loads of low fat products, and these things clearly aren't working, and yet the government and GP practices are still intervening and prescribing these diets which potentially are causing obesity. I don't know.
Okay, there is a lot on the table. So we've had the role of pleasure in eating, which I think we haven't really talked about so far. We've talked about the weight loss guru here, who's now worried it's all going to go backwards. More scepticism about set points and whether our bodies really want to, make us fat. And actually, aren't we not just filling the hole in our stomachs, but the hole in our soul with the things that we eat? Talked about impaired metabolism as well through type 2 diabetes, and indeed that's a question I wanted to ask about health. Is that you said our health is getting better and better and better, and yet we're also told there is an epidemic of type 2 diabetes. So I don't think you can answer all of those.
It's strange I'm a chef and I haven't got to this point. I've got to this point without mentioning enjoyment of food, which the heart of all my writing is to kind of get people to strip away a lot of the guilt that people feel about eating. If eating has become something of a sort of moral battleground for people, you're constantly being told that you're doing life wrong and you're committing some sort of sin, and we talk about all this very moralistic language about what you do and don't eat, which I find really problematic because I'm a chef, I love food, and I want people to enjoy eating because I think it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important for us socially. So yes, we should find pleasure in food, but we should also, the things that food does really well in our lives are things like, bringing us together socially and bringing us together as a family and coming together with friends and eating together is this really, really important social thing. And, one of the things that we very rarely talk about, which causes enormous harm to people's health, is a reduction in social connectivity with people. So if you can find pleasure in food and use food to bring you together, then that is probably the best thing that food can do for your health, whatever that food might be it chocolate or pizza or anything like that. The evolutionary point, or the fact that our bodies wouldn't do that to us. I mean, there is no evolutionary pressure on humans right now. Pretty much, very very little. We will not evolve any more, really, or less, just because of the protections we have. We're not dying in huge numbers as children, so we've got very little evolutionary pressure. The fact that our bodies wouldn't do that to us, well, our bodies don't really care about our health beyond breeding age. From an evolutionary perspective, we need to get to a point where we survive to produce children and spread our genes further further into subsequent generations. The reason perhaps why, and there's been a few studies on this, why there's this spectrum of body weights across populations. When food is freely available, is probably because there are different evolutionary pressures which will help your survival. For some populations of humans, it would have been good for people to be lean and fast-moving and able to hunt and able to run away from stuff that's going to eat them. For other populations, perhaps sort of more isolated island populations, it would be a good idea, evolutionary strategy, to be able to store a lot of calories, because you will have sort of constant insecure food supply, which has been the until now has been the sort of thing that's blighted humanity's existence and every living creature's existence, really. It's only this last few hundred years where we've had that access to food. So, there are always trade-offs in health. So for some people, from an evolutionary perspective, it would have been a good idea to store a lot of fat when food's freely available. For others, it wouldn't be. I'm not saying there's complete genetic determinism. I said 70% heritable. There is an awful lot of environmental influence, which explains the socioeconomic things we talked about. But there's our body, I said, doesn't care about our long-term health past the age of about 16, to be honest.
I think with genetic determinants as well, it's not just determinants, it's about susceptibility. So it's not because you have certain genes that you're definitely going to be a certain size. And I think that's where wealth and choice and privilege play into it as well, because people can fight against their genes by making certain choices and enacting certain behaviours and not become a higher weight, if that makes sense. It's not determined, is it? It's about susceptibility. So I think that's maybe what you were saying, that maybe middle class women that are managing to remain slim, potentially having these genes. It is about choice and being able to make health a priority and to choose health behaviours that maybe help you fight against your genes, even if you have that genetic predisposition towards high weight.
It's also worth saying, I'm not saying this is a huge factor, but it's also worth saying there are enormous number of studies about on weight stigma, which show that people who are larger earn less money and have less career prospects and are less employable and are sort of less trusted in society. So there may well be, that may well be part of it, that it's harder to you're more sort of fixed into a lower income because you're a larger weight, and then that may explain some of the sort of socioeconomic gradient, which is, I find really disturbing aspect of weight stigma, that we stigmatise people in that way based on their appearance. People. There's loads of studies showing that people earn less money over a career. They're less likely to be promoted. They're less likely to be successful in interviews if they're larger. Less likely to be invited for interviews as well. So there is that. There's possibly a two-way thing in the socioeconomic gradient. Chris.
Yeah, going to your point and your point, Risa. I said I agree with nearly everything in it, but the one thing I kind of have a quibble with, and this is a battle of ideas, so let's try and find some point of disagreement, is I got the impression that it goes back to the determinism, really. I think you push the determinism a bit too much, to the point where it just seems that there's nothing anyone can do about it. It's all about socioeconomic circumstances and genetics. And your point is very well made about the difference between going on a diet and changing a diet. I'm quite sure that yo-yo dieting doesn't work. I think changing a diet a little bit does work. I hate to use personal experience, but nearly everybody else talks about obesity, does that, and sells a book out of it, so not you, I don't know. But many people. But I lost about 1.5 stone a few years ago, mainly from I just gave up drinking for 3 months. Alcohol doesn't get much of a look in actually in this discussion. A huge source of calories for people like me, and I quite like losing a little bit of weight. And I stopped eating cheese in the evening. I read something, I think Reese Witherspoon said that when she bulks up for a role, she just eats cheese in the evening. That seems to do it. So I thought, well, I can live without the cheese in the evening, quite like it, but I can live without it. I switched to whiskey and soda from red wine and beer. And it's been no great sacrifice. I tend to have sugar snaps rather than crisps at lunchtime. Quite a healthy choice, but I quite like it. So that's not going on a diet, but it's made, I haven't put the weight back on. So I don't want people to be too negative about lifestyle changes that you can freely make, many of them fairly easily. Your point about the, I mean, I think you have a point, right? I mean, it does seem a contradiction to say that people got no choice in it, and yet poor women are making the wrong choices. I would go back to the fact that the figures are not that far off, actually. 21% for the richest people, 29% for the poorest people. To put it another way, the poorest people are 40% more likely to be obese. To put it another way, 79% of the richest people are not obese, and 71% of the poorest people are not obese, right? We get told we live in an obesogenic society. The majority of people are not obese. So I kind of reject the determinism, although the point is absolutely taken on the importance of genetics. There is still a lot that people can do. And just quickly, I mean, diabetes is just one disease. I mean, you just need to look at the statistics in the round. Yes, diabetes has gone up, and you hear a lot about it because you don't hear the good news about all the other diseases going down. And yes, I agree with the person who says we should basically chill out about obesity. If people want to do something about it, they can do something about it by and large. The government is going to try lots of things that aren't going to work. A lot of the things that do have a big influence on obesity, we can't do a lot about. I think actually a lot of people who are obese are perfectly happy being obese. They don't really want to change their lifestyles. It's too much of a sacrifice. They want to keep swilling beer and eating pizza, and why not?
Okay.
Oh, I kind of object to that.
Go on.
No, I think that what you just said then is kind of characteristic of the cultural idea about high weight. So what you just said was, fat people are drinking loads of beer.
Well, some do. I'm not saying they all do.
Yeah, but that's a cultural stereotype.
But it's true of me. That's why I was slightly overweight.
It's actually a false stereotype. That BMI is not a marker of diet quality. It's not a marker of physical activity. It's not a marker of any of those things. So people can have higher body weights and they can be physically active, and they may lose weight if they change their lifestyle. They may not lose weight if they change their lifestyle. People can have high weights and eat a very balanced diet. And so I think we have to be really careful of sort of these cultural stereotypes, which leads to stigma and leads to this idea that people have made the wrong choices and that they're to blame for their high weight or to blame for their disease. Well,
I don't think we should be blaming anyone. It shouldn't really be an issue. It should be a niche event of the Battle of Ideas every year. It shouldn't be front page news all the time. I don't think it's an important enough issue. And for people who do think it's important, most of them, not maybe all of them, most of them can do something about it. My point is, I know a lot of middle-aged men who are not on the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder who just like eating fine food, lots of wine, drink lots of beer, know that they've got a beer belly as a result of it, but they're not bothered about it. It's not a big deal to them.
Right, okay, I'm going to go out to the audience. I'm going to throw something in before I go out to the audience and then go out to the audience, which is about diabetes statistics, because I'm also a bit worried about those just as much as I am about obesity statistics. So I wrote an article a few years ago because there was this claim that diabetes rates had gone up by 50% in something like 5 years. Something ridiculous. As far as I could tell, a lot of that, I mean, some of it may be true, but some of it was about goalpost moving, changing the definition of diabetes. And some of it seemed to be actually going out and looking for diabetes, that actually people are much more routinely tested for blood glucose or whatever than they would have been in the past. So is that a case, I'm asking you to come back to later, of finding cases that were already there that we just didn't know about, rather than the actual rate of type 2 diabetes going up? So I'll leave that with you to think about, but please pay attention to all the lovely questions that we're going to get from the audience now. So
yes, nobody's raised the changing kind of eating patterns over the last 2-3 decades that, yes, you've raised that there's more availability of food, but you go out on the high street, and I
came to Britain for the first time in the 60s from the United States, where we already had fast food and everything else. And you came here, and I don't know if anybody remembers, there was Golden Egg. I think that was about the only fast food chain. And you go along now, and there's just the total availability of food. Reading B. Wilson's book, The Way We Now, I found a real eye-opener of the uniformity of food across the world now, that it used to be 30 years ago, people ate differently, and that the types of food, and now there's this incredible industrialized. The promotion of snacks to kids, you know, the finger of fudge from 20 years ago, and if you were a good mum, you gave them their chocolate when they came out of school, which raises the issue of nobody's raised obesity amongst children. And the thing that really concerns me is this sort of feeling that if you want to be happy, you've got to eat pizza and chocolate, and that there is a kind of a way of you get used to, and it sounds very negative to say that, but the less sugar you eat, the less you need to eat sugar, and all the things. I think the positives of going into schools and getting them to eat a wider variety of food and vegetables and fruit, and getting them to eat that rather than giving them their finger of fudge is very positive, rather than say, oh, well, just let them eat what they want and feel good about it.
I'm interested in how sort of best to tackle this from a public health perspective, given that alongside the kind of public health problem of obesity, there's also the sort of, alongside it, another public health problem, which is a rise in eating disorders, and also just a general rise in disordered eating, I think, particularly among women, but among men as well. I think often the public health measures brought about by the government, having calories on things, and often the people who kind of it's geared towards, it's not very effective, but then it just fuels a kind of societal problem of disordered eating and the kind of the other side, and how do you kind of intervene and kind of without tackling both at the same time, I suppose.
I've been overweight since my teenage years. I've done the yo-yo up and down dieting ever since then, really. I'm really interested in, I don't want to give up my chocolate either, because it brings me a lot of pleasure, but really interested in that concept of how food has been a coping strategy for me for dealing with pain, with emotional pain, and it is for quite a lot of women, I would say, probably more than men, which maybe their coping strategy is alcohol or something else for men, more likely. I'm also really interested in the concept of us having a natural body weight which we will gravitate to, because the only time I've successfully lost weight is when I'm pregnant, as though my body is saying to me, actually, you don't need any more to be healthy. And during my pregnancy, I go off food. If I'd had lots of successive pregnancies quite quickly close together, I might have lost a lot of weight. Mm-hmm. But for me, my body says, you don't need food during pregnancy. You've got your store of weight and you're doing okay. Mm-hmm. And then I'm told by my midwife, you're starving your baby. Mm-hmm. To have a 9 pound 5 ounce baby would suggest not.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to Chris, there's some beautiful rhetoric there, which kind of went over some of the main points here. So you talk about how, like you said quite explicitly, that there's things that the government can do which are basically fiddle around at the edges around, sugar tax and those sorts of things. But there's nothing else we can really do, except the rest of the panel are talking about that there's vast inequalities. We live in a vast unequal society. And even if you want to go beyond simple ideas about choice, things about the need for pleasure. So what you're all talking about is the stress paradigm, these things that we need things to deal with the reality of our life. Hilary Graham wrote a lovely book called Life's a Drag, about how people in some instances can smoke as a way to be healthy because it helps you to deal with the shitness of your life. And I think it's quite interesting that the sort of more evidence-based on this side here, and your evidence is that you've got lots of middle-aged, middle-class friends who, they like drinking wine and they like eating fine food. And it's in a sense, you guys are kind of protected because your average life expectancy is about 10 to 15 years more than people at the lower end of society. And so again, it comes back to the wider issues of health that we're talking about over on this side, which is that, yeah, you can talk about obesity, But there are bigger issues here that people's health are affected by inequality in huge ways. So the idea that the government can't really do anything, sure, they can do huge things, which are to deal with the social determinants of health, rather than to, every time we talk about an issue like obesity, talk about it as an individual choice space.
Yeah, it seems to me sensible people, or people I regard as sensible, say always one shouldn't pay too much attention to what one eats. And the minute one does that, things start going wrong. So, but somehow I doubt that, because that doesn't seem much like a solution to me, because that can go either way. You can be totally careless in that manner. But one thing I do want to ask, and I have no idea about this, is Japan. There are a lot of people who say Japanese culture is geared towards a certain diet which keeps them slim, and that's why so many are slim. And I'd ask, is that really true, or is that just a myth?
The one thing that I feel quite strongly about is the Ansel Keys, obviously research that sort of said that fat's bad. And I'm just wondering whether if that is when we really started to become a fatter nation, is when, well, across the Western world, when fat was totally demonized and we were all pushed towards a grain-based diet as being the one that was the right way to go.
So we've got obesogenic environment, which I'm surprised nobody had mentioned already. So child obesity. So even if it's a choice for us, what about the kids? We should be doing something that makes sure that they don't follow our problems. And somebody said more generally, how can we tackle it from a public health perspective? And there was discussion about the emotional side of eating as well. There's the discussion about Japan. And Ansel Keys, and which kind of fits in with this 1980 thing, I think, possibly. But anyway, and I also wanted to throw in as well, in terms of things that the government does to help us, is like denying people healthcare because of their BMI, which seems to be a pattern. It pops up every so often that suddenly people get denied hip replacements or cataract operations or all sorts of weird stuff because their BMI is over 40 and they have to lose weight before they get it, and they're saying it because we're trying to help people make the right choices, which sounds pretty vicious to me. Anyway, so as any of that you want to come back on?
Yeah, all of it. The obesogenic environment I'll start with, because that sort of struck me as an interesting comment. And it's something I'm often told is that the food environment now, the variety of choice available to us now, is far worse than it used to be at some point in the past. And I don't know if anyone in this room can say that's definitely their lived experience. I was a child of the 70s and 80s, and my diet was fucking terrible. I mean, I had crispy pancakes and potato waffles, and I didn't eat salad. I mean, there's about 3 different vegetables available in the shops. We now have an extraordinary array of the most incredible fresh produce in pretty much every town, and supermarkets in every town in the United Kingdom, which was never available. We have this enormous variety of enormous different things. It's incredibly easy to find incredibly healthy food within a reasonable distance of every home. There are some, and it's probably more a case in the US. There are some areas which people talk of as being food deserts, but most reasonable-sized towns in the UK have a supermarket. Obviously, some people without access to transport will perhaps struggle, but that's certainly not got worse over the years. What has happened globally, there is more of a reliance on a smaller number, but at an individual level, pretty much everyone in the world has access to more variety of food now than they did 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. And I find that a really strange narrative which people often recite to me as fact, which doesn't seem to line up with any experience or any data at all.
Anything else you want to talk about there out of those child obesity or Japan or?
I mean, Japan's interesting. Obviously, it's a slightly genetically divergent population. What people think of as the Japanese diet, which is, I guess, lots of rice and lots of fish, very high carbohydrate. Actually, they eat quite a lot of carbohydrate and a lot of sugar, perhaps more than a lot of other places. It's not necessarily a diet that people think of that as being a diet that's been around for centuries. It's probably not. It changed quite a lot throughout the 20th century. I think, I think there are sort of socio-cultural things, which generally the biggest determinants of sort of a lot of these things are socio-cultural rather than sort of an individual level. People have a different attitude to food. Food gets used a lot in sharing, and there are genetic differences. There's certainly for people for Japanese men especially, when they start to put on weight, they get type 2 diabetes far quicker because they have a different capacity for storing fat within individual fat cells. But I think these things are incredibly complex, and most of it's to do with society, and some of it's to do with genetics. But I wouldn't say that diet is reasonably good. But there's also an enormous amount of junk food and convenience food and vending machines in Japan.
Okay, Helen.
So I'll probably just talk to the childhood obesity and then the emotional eating. In terms of, I think you said promoting variety and healthy foods for children in schools and that kind of thing, and I think that's incredibly important. But what I think is also important to say is I think it's really, really important that we don't frame that around weight. Those are interventions that can be really helpful for all children across the board. And I think what we need to remember is, particularly in children, we need to be focusing more on health promotion, encouraging variety, competency as well around foods like chocolate and sweets and sugar and things like that, not banning them because we know that drives people to eat more of those foods, and avoiding talking about weight and bodies in terms of their bodies being wrong if they're a higher weight and things like that, because that's harmful in terms of their eating patterns, disordered eating, and the future weight gain. Dieting is one of the biggest risk factors for future weight gain. So I think all of those things are really important, but I don't think we should be framing them in terms of this is a solution to weight in children. It's they're interventions that can be beneficial to all children across the board. It's really interesting because we've got two people in the audience, sort of saying, and actually this is really typical, somebody at the back saying, I changed my lifestyle and I lost loads of weight, and then somebody else saying, I've done lots of lifestyle change and done lots of diets and my weight hasn't changed. And actually both of those experiences can be true exactly the same time. With regards to emotional eating, it's a really, really complicated, tricky topic, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you. But there are things that people can do, especially if you're not interested in going on the diet kind of like cycle again. There are things that you can do to improve your health. From an emotional eating perspective, usually we look at kind of, instead of taking food away as a coping strategy, just adding some other things in. And there's lots of work that can be done around disordered relationships with food and emotional eating if you're interested in exploring those.
Okay, right. So Chris, I'm sure there's loads you want to talk about.
A couple of things. Yeah, I'm not sure why. Where is he? I'm not sure why you thought I was ducking the issue of socioeconomic circumstances. I thought I kind of brought it up and addressed it at length, but I'll happily do so again. I mean, my point was that pretty much everyone would like to live in a society in which everybody had a great job for life, unemployment was 0%, all the schools were absolutely top-notch, there was no socioeconomic inequality, everybody was in a happy family. But the reality is, it can't be done, and you might have various political things that you think the government should do, but the government is probably not going to do them. What the government is going to do is bow to the specific demands of people from public health, which is to ban this and tax that and get rid of the advertising from this and so on. And that's what we see. So public health people will put these conferences on and they'll talk about the root causes of various health issues, which always come down to poverty and inequality and all the rest of it. But they're in no position to do anything about those things. They're only in a position to do what they actually do, which is to lobby for specific policies, and the governments tend to listen to the ones that involve them bringing in a bit of tax revenue. That's just the way it is. And on the food point, I mean, I very much agree with what Anthony was saying. I think probably most of us who have children would admit to ourselves that we used to eat a lot more sweets and consume more sugar than they do. But I suspect people romanticize past diets. But we do have the evidence of what people used to eat. The Family Food Survey was set up in 1940, and you can see very specifically what people were consuming. Yes, they were eating more food in the house than outside the house, but the food they were eating was not particularly healthy, to say the least. People, if they went out, they would have fish and chips, which is about 2,000 calories. They would have bread and dripping at home. There were huge amounts of sugar and desserts. I'm quite sure people eat dessert less than they used to. I was told by a restaurant owner in London that they've given up, so even offering desserts, because only 5% of their customers are buying them. We never had low-calorie drinks. All the milk was full fat, and so on and so on and so on. So we can see in pretty thorough empirical work how the British diet has changed over the years. And sugar consumption has gone down a lot, and overall calorie consumption has gone down a lot. And people in public health often kind of dispute this and say, "Oh, we're not sure about the figures," and people misremember what they ate. But even when Public Health England tried to adjust for underreporting, and it is an issue that obese people tend to underreport what they eat a lot more than healthy weight people, as they're called, and obviously as number of obese people increase, the amount of underreporting increases. But even when they adjusted for that, the figures still showed that we are consuming fewer calories on average than we did in the 1970s. But the words "on average" are very important there. This is what is true of the mean average is not necessarily true of people on the extremes. So clearly there are people who are eating a lot more than the average either today or then.
Okay, so finally, you're the dissident of this session. It's just very quickly sum up, what people should take away or why they should buy your book or whatever you want to approach the question.
Buying books is a very complex subject. I tried to get across how complex a subject it is. It's quite a big book. There's a lot of information in there because we cannot oversimplify these problems, because every time we try and oversimplify it, that leads us towards the wrong solution. It leads us to thinking it's all about sugar. It's not, that which leads us to banning and taxing sugar and doing all those sort of things. We think it's all about eat less, move more. It's more complex than that. So it's really an exploration of how complex it is, where within that some of the solutions might lie, where we perhaps should be looking, But I think the biggest takeaway of all is that there are a huge amount of things you can do. I'm not someone who's saying we should not change our lifestyles at all and everything's just fine. There's a huge amount of stuff that people could do to improve their health. A number of behaviours, but this focus on weight as being the most important thing, and this sort of defining factor which defines aesthetics and defines health, is inherently problematic and inherently causes harm to an enormous number of people, and we don't think about the extent of that harm, because people talk about the association between obesity and poor health, and there is an association there, and it's largely just an association. But what we don't do is perhaps consider that a lot of the stigma that we're forcing on people for living in a way, looking a way that society doesn't expect you to look, might be causing a lot of those health harms, and living in a stigmatized body is something which does cause an enormous amount of harm, direct harm to people's health, and that could well be a confounding factor in a lot of the associations we look at between diet and between body weight and health.
Thank you very much. Can we thank our panel, please?